Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in downtown Washington, D.C., where we're talking to Bonnie Glaser, one of CSIS's top Asia experts. It's always great talking to you. I know that you're pinched for time, so I'll dive right into it. North Korea, we've had a summit meeting that a lot of people didn't think would happen. And if they did think would have happened with a little bit more preconditions that we've seen. From your standpoint as somebody who's been watching this space for a long time and all the incremental moves, including the 8 other agreements the international community has with North Korea, what do you think are the deliverables from this discussion, the historic discussion the president had with Kim Jong-un?
The deliverables so far appear to be wins for Kim Jong-un. Particularly the cancellation of the U.S. ROC military exercises. And there's always a possibility that that could be walked back because that was not actually included in the joint statement. Sounds like the president sort of threw that in later on. But that's an example, just one, of a win, I think, for Kim Jong-un. The joint statement says that both sides agree to complete denuclearization, but there is no mention of verification. Of course, there's also no mention of it being irreversible. There's no definition of denuclearization, and in fact says denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, not of North Korea. There is no timeline, and there really is no mention of anything that the U.S. Would put on its agenda for perhaps human rights, which some people have talked about should be included, or the kinds of things that we would want to see Kim Jong-un do in the future. So the policy of keeping maximum sanctions, I think there's already been a signal from President Trump. He referred to the Chinese loosening up along the border, and he said that's okay. So that's a signal to the Chinese that this growing activity, the walking away from the UN sanctions, which the Chinese have really never had complete buy-in anyway, that's already underway, and Trump has said that it's acceptable. So at the end of the day, I think we're already going to see these sanctions to begin to be perhaps ignored increasingly, maybe not only by China, but by other countries as well. We still see North Korean ships that are operating in the high seas that are getting coal or delivering coal illegally. So there's a lot of illegal activity that continues. And the United States has gotten the destruction of a missile engine factory, which really doesn't tell us much of anything, in my view. That just seems like a giveaway. And Kim Jong-un has not really made any specific promises to the United States. Kim has also won international recognition. So before March, he'd never met with a foreign leader. All of a sudden, he has met with President Moon twice, Xi Jinping twice, President Trump. Next is likely to be Vladimir Putin and maybe Prime Minister Abe. And this was a coming out party for Kim Jong-un. I mean, celebrating in Singapore, going around drinking, and showing his people that he is now an internationally accepted leader and maybe a country that is now accepted as a nuclear weapon state. And that is almost implicit. It's not explicit. But there is potentially a definition of denuclearization that accepts North Korea as a nuclear weapon state.
So from your standpoint, what has to be next? Because North Korea is a nation that has violated every one of the 8 agreements, so it's in the driver's seat and sort of pushing a lot of these events forward. What should be next in this relationship, in the dialogue, in the discussion? And at what point do all of the international partners, the 6, for example, get involved in this, given that denuclearization is going to be a complicated effort? It's likely to include the IAEA, obviously until, once we define what denuclearization is, and you astutely pointed out that, it wasn't limited to North Korea, but rather the language the North Koreans always like to use, which is denuclearization of the whole peninsula. Talk to us about what has to be next in this to make sure that we get to some form of verifiable, real deal, not just positive atmospherics.
Well, President Trump said the Secretary Pompeo will lead negotiations with North Korea. He did not say who else will be at the table. He talked about possible peace treaty negotiations, and he did say that South Korea and China should be part of that process. We don't know whether those will be separate negotiations. I mean, the Chinese have always talked for the dual track, which is a conversation about a peace treaty and about denuclearization. We could go back to the six-party talks. That's one possible mechanism. That's what Beijing wants. I doubt that's what the Trump administration would really like to do. So there's the potential to have different countries at the table depending on what the topic is. So if it's a peace treaty, it might include the signatories to the armistice, which, by the way, don't include South Korea, but they do include, of course, China, North Korea, and the United States. And then there could be another set of players that talk about denuclearization. But the real issue, I think, as we begin to walk down that path of talking about getting rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons, the first step is a declaration. So the North Koreans have to declare what they have. This is not, of course, just weapons. It is about fissile material. It is about all of the elements of their programs. And some people have said that it should also include chemical and biological weapons. That's not yet clear whether it will be that expansive. And so after that declaration, we'll be able to tell how serious North Korea really is, because they may just declare a very small number of sites.
And I wanted to bring the Japanese into this because Shinzo Abe has met with President Trump on two sort of rapid, short order summits, one of which was on North Korea's medium-range missiles, which constitute a threat to Japan. The question I've got is, if you look at it, President Trump surprised his G7 allies at the summit with some of his demands. It looks now like he surprised not just South Korea, but Japan, as well as the U.S. military, in asking for a cessation of military exercises. How significant is that the American president is surprising some of his closest allies?
I think it's extremely significant. The United States has more friction with its allies than ever, and with virtually all of our allies. The South Koreans will be reluctant, I think, to criticize Trump, but I think they will be a little astonished that Trump has already said that he would like to withdraw U.S. troops from the peninsula because it will save money. Doesn't seem to care that much about South Korea's security. By the way, those troops are really there to deter a conventional strike. And North Korea has said nothing about reducing its conventional arsenal, its artillery that it has arrayed right opposite South Korea. So it's remarkable to have a president, obviously for the first time meeting a North Korean leader, embracing somebody who has obviously been more of a dictator than any other leader, putting so many people in gulags, killing his uncle as well as his brother, and then celebrating this guy and saying it's such an honor to meet with him, while treating our very close allies, the Canadians, for example, the latest to be the brunt of Trump's anger, treating them so poorly.
Where do you think, from an economic carrot standpoint, one thing that Kim Jong-un has been focused on doing is to try as best as he can within the narrow confines of really reinventing the North Korean economy. The Chinese have talked to him about, look, you can modernize your economy but still remain an authoritarian state, which is a model that many other governments have used. Vladimir Putin uses that model. The model, sadly, is becoming more popular, including in Europe and among EU states as well, as we've seen with Orban and worries about Poland. How do you think the economic dynamic is going to play, since Kim is trying to change the economy, liberalize the economy in some measures, whether in experimental form? Everybody's been debating about whether that's the case. Talk to us about the economic reform piece on how that's likely to fit in with Kim's calculus.
Well, I think so far Kim Jong-un's economic policy has been permissive in the sense that he has allowed these markets to operate. We have not seen an active economic reform policy. He really has not tried to create an environment in which investment is going to come in. He has allowed Chinese goods to come into markets, and so you have more than half of North Koreans who have some role in this economic activity that goes on that is not run by the state. And by allowing that to happen, the economy has begun to grow. But I think what the Chinese really want is more sort of top-down reform, not just bottom-up reform. They believe that there could be an active relationship between Chinese and North Korean businesses, and that North Korea could really adopt China's model. And it's interesting that Xi Jinping last year at the 19th Party Congress actually proposed that China's development model could now be an option for developing countries. So it's something they're really actively pushing now. And for years, all of the experts I've talked to in China who study North Korea, they look at North Korea through the lens of China's experience, and they say, well, we've had this political system where we've remained sort of repressive, limited the amount of democracy that can take place, but we've opened up economically. It's worked for us. It could work for North Korea. You know, the Chinese would like North Korea to be somewhat less dependent on China, but yet they want to retain leverage over North Korea. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. And I think we're going to see going forward a competition between South Korea and China for the economy of North Korea. Both are going to want to get in there and create circumstances in which there's integration with their economies, in which they can create dependence and to try and influence and shape events in North Korea.
And that takes us to China, right? Because China has wanted this to remain a percolating issue. It consumes bandwidth in Seoul. It consumes bandwidth in Tokyo. It certainly has consumed bandwidth in the United States. From China's perspective, a resolution of this would be negative because a reunification of the Koreas would mean American troops and listening posts, et cetera, on its border, unless North Korea remains some form of buffer state. Talk to us about, and the Chinese have always been the ones who both supported sanctions, but also given a complete pass and funneled all sorts of goods without which North Korea would have collapsed long ago. Where do you think China's mind is going to be, particularly at a time when the Trump administration is turning the screws on China on economic issues? We had the whole ZTE issue, which seems to have been resolved with a fine in China's favor, and some patents that trademarks that were given to the president's daughter. Some allege. Talk to us a little bit about the China dynamic and how that's likely to play out, given that there are so many outstanding factors in the U.S.-China, and China-Pyongyang relationship at the moment.
So I see that the outcome of this summit is really a win for Beijing, because North Korea will go forward as a more viable state. Military force has been taken off the table for the moment. The sanctions are going to begin to ease. And China is once again in the game on the Korean Peninsula. And Xi Jinping had kept a distance, arm's length at least, between him and Kim Jong-un. He had not had a summit with him. He had tried to work with President Trump to implement the sanctions to some extent because he wanted to fend off this pressure on trade that was coming from the United States. And that was working to some extent for a while. And so I think that the Chinese were shocked when Trump said that he would be willing to meet with Kim. And we saw Xi Jinping move very quickly to arrange this first summit, which then, of course, turned into another summit with Kim Jong-un. And in doing that, I think we can see that China's influence has really resurged in North Korea. And so as Kim Jong-un left Pyongyang, he was flying in a Chinese plane. It was an Air China 747. And when it landed, of course, we saw that, that Kim brought up this issue in the conversations with President Trump about having the troops removed. Even before heading to the summit, Kim talked about how he wanted to have the military exercises frozen. And so this is a Chinese ask. Let's remember that North Korea had unilaterally stated that it would freeze its nuclear tests and missiles tests. It had no desire to have the U.S. rock exercises to be frozen or suspended at that point. But China is very concerned about the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So this is a Chinese demand. Just as I think the shutdown of the test site, the explosions that we saw take place in front of all the reporters, the Chinese have been really alarmed about the potential for contamination of their air, water, and soil in northeast China. This was an ask to Kim Jong-un. So even if North Korea retains some of its nuclear weapons, which I think ultimately the Chinese really don't want to see, but they could live with it, if they end up with a North Korea that's viable economically and has very good relations with China, that's a good outcome for them. They've already gotten rid of some of the threats that were posed to them. And then at the end of the day, it looks like Trump wants to withdraw U.S. troops from the peninsula. We can't think of a bigger win for China. So I think the Chinese are smiling. They like this outcome.
And ROK is Republic of Korea, which is obviously the formal name for South Korea. And the reason he took an Air China 747, Bonnie, is you can't bring an armored train all the way to Singapore, or maybe you could, but it would have taken at something like 37 miles an hour, a little bit too long.
He has a plane. It's an old sort of, I think, Soviet-era Aleutian that Kim Jong-un did fly when he went to meet Xi Jinping the second time in Dalian. But I think that he was concerned that it might not be completely safe. But I think the Chinese were thrilled to have that symbolism of they are delivering Kim to the summit with Trump.
Right. It's positively extraordinary. So from your standpoint, what does the international community and what does the American president have to bear in mind as he goes, or Mike Pompeo, as they go into what is really the hardest part of this, which is actually deliverables? What do you think are the top three things that everybody's got to bear in mind so that we get to where we need, which is de-escalation on the peninsula and actually addressing the things that are the irritants in the relationship, which is a belligerent North Korea, one that's armed with nuclear weapons and overwhelming conventional capability as well?
Well, first, I do think that we have to clarify the definition of denuclearization, and we do have to get a complete declaration from North Korea. And we have to make it very clear up front that that could be a deal breaker right there if we don't get a real declaration. Up until now, the North Koreans really have said very little about their uranium enrichment program, and it's probably spread all over the country, not to mention the fissile-material and the other places where they've done missile testing. So there's a lot of parts to this program that we need to get them to declare. And then secondly, we do have to make it clear that there must be international inspectors. And this is where agreements in the past have fallen apart, where the North Koreans have not allowed inspectors into their country. So this is absolutely a must. And I would say, thirdly, that we should put on hold anything that would damage our relations with our allies. I don't think that we should begin a process of suspending our military exercises, which are necessary to ensure that South Korea is prepared in the event that there were a strike by North Korea. At the end of the day, we can't keep 28,500 troops in South Korea that are not prepared to defend themselves and the South Koreans. That's doing a disservice to our servicemen. So I think it's essential that we continue those exercises and that we stop talking about bringing these troops home. Of course, we shouldn't rule that out in the future, but it shouldn't be something that is front-loaded as part of a deal. I just think that's something that should come much later.
And especially when the South Koreans are the ones who've borne the brunt of the entire new installation in the camp and contribute so much to the alliance and the support of those troops. One last follow-up question. You mentioned at the very top, because in part we were talking about sanctions before we got started, about the de facto loosening of sanctions. There are those who would give the administration credit and the president credit for really ratcheting the sanctions up, using targeted financial instruments against whether they're Chinese or other institutions to try to put that pressure, the Banco Delta Asia strategy, if you will, that proved so successful by the Bush administration. From your standpoint, Is it possible to keep sanctions going, and what's the way to keep that sanctions pressure going, given that it is something that has borne very, that has made a mark on Kim Jong-un?
I agree with you that sanctions probably were important in bringing Kim Jong-un back to the table. I think there were other factors, but I think that was one of them. And I do give the Trump administration credit for ratcheting up those sanctions. When Tillerson was Secretary of State, he went around and talked to every single counterpart, regardless of the country, and emphasized to them the importance of shutting down even their diplomatic relations with North Korea, not to mention trade or illegal interactions that businessmen were having and money laundering. And there's so many of these things that were really going on in every country. And China being at the centerpiece of that strategy. At the end of the day, I think it's going to be very difficult to sustain that at this point. I think that the president can try to make it a priority. He can talk to Xi Jinping, who appears to be a close buddy of his. And since Xi Jinping's ask was to save ZTE, Trump should figure out what his next ask should be of Xi Jinping. And maybe this is the important ask, is to sustain these sanctions until such time as we are certain that we share the definition of denuclearization and that Kim Jong-un is actually walking down that path and committed to implementing them. So I would like to see that, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult. The very image of Xi Jinping on Chinese television with Kim Jong-un, the first time these two leaders met, I think was a signal to people who live in Northeast China that it was time to restart those businesses and get those trucks moving across that bridge into North Korea, because people understood that that meant the Chinese government was going to begin to ease off those sanctions.
Bonnie Glaser of CSIS, one of the leading Asia experts here. Bonnie, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure and a treat talking to you.
Thank you, Vago.